For a few seconds, the American pilots high over the East China Sea could not understand what they were seeing. A column of fire and smoke had climbed off the horizon, taller than any mountain, punching up through the clouds. Some of them, more than 100 miles away, thought for a moment that a second sun had risen in the wrong part of the sky. It was not a sun. It was the death of the largest warship ever built, and of almost every man still inside her. Nearly 3,000 of them died in a single afternoon. Most were never recovered. A great many were younger than the men in the planes above. This is the story of a ship that was meant to be unsinkable, and of the young men who were sent out on her knowing, most of them, that they were not coming back. It is the story of a mission that even the men who ordered it could not fully explain. And it is the story of what it means to be sent to your death for a symbol. To understand the size of what was lost, you first have to understand the size of the thing itself. Her name was Yamato. It was an old poetic word for Japan itself, the name of the ancient heartland, the name a nation gives to its own soul, and she was built to match it. She displaced around 72,000 tons at full load, far heavier than anything the Americans or the British had ever put to sea. She was longer than 3 football fields laid end to end. Her main guns were the largest ever mounted on a warship, each barrel wide enough for a man to crawl into, each one able to throw a shell the weight of a small car more than 25 miles. The shells for those guns were taller than the men who loaded them. To move and feed and fight a ship this size took a small city of men. Well over 3,000 of them lived inside her steel, in a maze of passageways and ladders and compartments that a new sailor could get lost in for days. There were cooks and doctors, gunners and engineers, radio men and stokers, boys who had never seen the sea before they were sent to serve on the greatest ship afloat. Most of them would spend years together, and in the end, they would die together. She was so secret while she was being built that the shipyard at Kure raised enormous screens of rope netting around her, so that ordinary people could not see what was taking shape. Workers were watched. Photographs were forbidden. A ship the length of a small town was assembled behind a curtain, in near silence, because she was not only a weapon, she was a secret, and she was a promise. The promise was simple. As long as Japan had ships like this, Japan could not be beaten at sea. And for a while, the men who served on her lived inside that promise. Yamato was so large, so comfortable by the standards of a warship, so often kept safe in harbor away from the fighting, that the rest of the fleet gave her a bitter nickname. They called her the Hotel Yamato. While smaller ships bled and burned across the Pacific, the pride of the Navy often sat at anchor, too precious to risk. The men who crewed her were, in a sense, guarding a legend, keeping it polished, keeping it whole. That is the quiet irony at the center of this story. The ship built to be the most powerful in the world spent most of the war being protected from it. Until the very end. Until there was nothing left to protect her for. By the spring of 1945, the war Japan had begun was collapsing inward. The great carriers were gone, sunk in earlier battles. The trained pilots were gone. The oil that a modern navy runs on had all but run out. American forces had landed on Okinawa, the last island before the home islands themselves, and a vast Allied fleet sat off its coast, pouring men and steel ashore. Japan was running out of everything except young men and the will to spend them. And so, in the first days of April, a plan was born that was less a battle plan than a funeral arranged in advance. The plan was called Operation Tengo. In translation, the word points to heaven. The idea was this: Yamato, the last great ship, together with a single light cruiser and 8 destroyers, would sail south toward Okinawa. She would smash through the American fleet. She would drive herself up onto the beach at Okinawa, deliberately run herself aground, and become an unsinkable steel fortress, firing those enormous guns into the enemy until the last shell was gone and the last man was dead. Then her crew would take up rifles and fight on shore as infantry. Read that again, slowly. The most sophisticated warship ever built was to be turned into a stationary gun battery on a beach, and then abandoned, and her sailors were to die on the sand. This was the mission. Everyone who heard it understood what it truly was. There is a detail that has followed this operation ever since, and it is one we have to handle with care. It is widely said that Yamato was given only enough fuel for a one-way voyage, that the tanks were filled for the trip out and not the trip home, because there would be no trip home. It is a powerful image, and it has been repeated in countless retellings. But the records are not so simple. Some accounts suggest the ship actually carried more fuel than the legend allows, perhaps because sympathetic officers quietly gave her all they could find. So we should say it honestly. The one-way fuel is part tradition, part fact, and the truth sits somewhere in the middle. What is not in doubt is the intent. No one who planned this expected the ship to come back. The orders themselves said as much, in the cold language of duty. This was to be a special attack, the same phrase used for the young pilots who were flying their planes directly into enemy ships. It was, in every way that mattered, a suicide operation carried out by an entire fleet at once. The only thing left to decide was how the men would meet it. The men aboard knew it too. Before she sailed, something happened on board that tells you everything about the mood of that night. The officers gathered. There was sake, the rice wine, passed around in a final gathering, and there was an argument, quiet and painful, about the youngest members of the crew. Yamato carried aboard her a number of naval cadets, boys still in training, teenagers with their whole lives in front of them. Some of the senior officers argued that these young ones should be put ashore before the ship sailed, that there was no reason for them to die on a mission that could accomplish nothing. Others argued they should stay and share the fate of the ship. In the end, some of the very youngest and the sick were sent off. Many more remained. Imagine being 17 years old on that deck, watching a friend walk down the gangway to safety, and understanding, without a word being said, why you were being kept aboard. Among the men who sailed was a junior officer named Yoshida Mitsuru. He was in his early 20s, an ensign, one of the educated young men swept into the Navy in the last years of the war. He would live through what was coming, one of the very few, and years later, he would write it all down in a spare, haunted memoir. Because of him, we are not left to guess at what the last hours aboard Yamato felt like. We have the words of a man who was there, who watched it happen, and who carried it for the rest of his life. His account is why this ship is more than a statistic to us. It has faces. It has voices. It has the memory of one young man who could not forget. The fleet sailed on the 6th of April 1945. Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers, 10 ships in all, steaming south into the dark, the last sortie of a navy that had once ruled half an ocean. Not one of these ships carried a single aircraft to protect it. There was nothing left to give them. The carriers that should have shielded them were on the bottom of the Pacific, and the pilots who might have flown from them were dead, or being held back for the suicide flights that were now Japan's main weapon. So the last great ships of the fleet went out naked to the sky, trusting to their guns, and to the weather, and to nothing else. They did not even get out of home waters unseen. As the ships passed through the Bungo Strait, the channel leading out from Japan's inland sea, they were spotted. 2 American submarines, lying in wait in exactly the place a careful enemy would watch, saw the great shapes moving in the night. They could not attack effectively, but they did something far more deadly. They sent a signal. They told the American fleet that Yamato was out, and where she was heading. From that moment, the outcome was almost certain. The mission had been built on a hope that was already dead, the hope that the world's largest battleship could cross hundreds of miles of open sea, in daylight, in the last spring of the war, without being found. She had been found before she was even clear of home. The next morning, the 7th of April, was grey and unsettled. Low cloud, rain squalls moving across a heaving sea. For a few hours, That weather was the only friend the fleet had, a curtain that might hide them from the sky. But the American commander of Okinawa had a decision to make, and he made it without hesitation. He would not wait for Yamato to reach his transports and his troops. He would send his aircraft out to meet her, far out at sea, and finish her there. He had the means to do it many times over. From the decks of his carriers, wave after wave of aircraft climbed into the grey morning. In total, across the day, the Americans would throw nearly 400 planes at the Japanese ships, dive bombers to shatter the decks, torpedo bombers to tear open the hull below the waterline, fighters to sweep aside any resistance, though by now there was almost none, because Yamato had no aircraft of her own. She had sailed, like the great British ships 3 years before her, with no air cover at all. 10 ships, alone, under an open sky, against the massed air power of a fleet that had learned, over 4 hard years, exactly how to kill a battleship. Just after 12:30, the first wave arrived. They came out of the cloud in their dozens, and the sea around the fleet erupted. Yamato bristled with anti-aircraft guns, more than 150 of them by the end of her career, and she threw up a wall of fire. She even loaded her giant main guns with special shells that burst into thousands of burning fragments, trying to swat the planes from the sky with the largest naval guns ever made. For a few minutes, the air was full of smoke and tracer and falling metal. But there were simply too many attackers, coming from too many directions at once. The first bomb struck home, then the first torpedo. The Americans had learned a brutal, effective lesson over the years. They concentrated their torpedoes on one side of the ship, the port side, again and again, so that the flooding could not be balanced out. A ship can survive holes on both sides that roughly cancel each other. It cannot so easily survive being torn open again and again along the same flank. Slowly, deliberately, they were rolling her over. Around her, her escorts were dying. The light cruiser Yahagi took a torpedo squarely in her engine room, early in the battle, and went dead in the water, helpless, and the aircraft came back for her again and again. Before she finally sank, she absorbed a punishment almost beyond belief, something on the order of 12 bombs and several torpedoes. Destroyers were blown apart, capsized, left burning, the sea between the ships filled with oil and wreckage and men. And still the attacks came. Aboard Yamato, the world was tilting. As more torpedoes struck the port side, the great ship began to list, to lean, further and further over. Below decks, in the vast engine and boiler rooms, men worked in a nightmare of heat and noise and rising water, trying to counter flood, deliberately letting the sea into compartments on the far side to keep her upright. In some of those compartments, that meant drowning their own shipmates at their posts to save the ship for a few more minutes. There was no time to warn them. There was no way out for them. They are among the nearly 3,000 who never came back, men who died in the dark to buy time that, in the end, bought nothing. By the early afternoon, the ship could not be saved, and the men in command knew it. The fleet commander was Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito. He had, by some accounts, argued against this entire mission from the start, seeing it for the waste it was. But he had obeyed. Now, with his flagship dying beneath him, he gave the orders to abandon the effort and save who could be saved. And then he did what the code of his time and place demanded of him. He shook hands with his officers, turned, and walked to his cabin, and shut the door, and chose to go down with the ship. He was never seen again. The ship's captain, Kosaku Aruga, stayed on the bridge. It is recorded that he had himself lashed to a fitting on the bridge, so that he could not be washed away, or tempted to save himself. And there he remained as the ship rolled over. Around him, sailors were leaping into the sea, or being thrown from the canting decks into the water far below. At around 2:20 in the afternoon, Yamato rolled completely onto her side, her masts sweeping down toward the waves, her great red hull rising into the air. Men slid down her flank into the oil-covered sea, and then, 3 minutes later, one of her enormous forward magazines, the sealed chambers where the shells and powder for those giant guns were stored, detonated. The explosion was so vast that it is hard to find human words for it. A pillar of fire and smoke rose several miles into the sky. The blast was felt and heard far away. That was the pillar the American pilots saw from over 100 miles off, the false sun on the horizon. It is believed the explosion was so violent that it may have destroyed some of the American aircraft still circling overhead, killing attackers and defenders together in one final convulsion. When the smoke thinned, the largest warship ever built was simply gone. Where she had been, there was only a spreading stain of oil, a scatter of debris, and in the water, among it all, the men. Of the roughly 3,300 men aboard Yamato, only around 276 were pulled from the sea alive, which means that more than 3,000 were not. Vice Admiral Ito was gone, Captain Aruga was gone, and with them went a generation of young sailors and cadets, boys who had been arguing about sake and duty on the deck just 2 nights before. To cross the whole operation, counting the cruiser Yahagi and the destroyers, the Japanese lost something in the region of 4,000 men in a single day. The Americans lost 10 aircraft and 12 men. Let those two numbers sit beside each other for a moment. 4,000, 12. That is not a battle in any ordinary sense. That is what happens when courage is sent, unprotected, against a way of war it can no longer answer. The men on Yamato did not lack bravery. They had it in a measure that is almost unbearable to think about. What they lacked was any chance at all. The survivors were picked up by the handful of destroyers that lived through the day, oil-blackened, burned, many of them barely conscious, and carried back to a Japan that had, in a single afternoon, lost the last ship of its once mighty fleet. From that day, the Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. 4 months later, the war was over. And here we come to the question that sits under this whole story, the one that has never been fully answered. Why? Why send the largest battleship in the world, and nearly 4,000 men, on a mission that the planners themselves knew could not succeed? By April of 1945, no one in the Japanese High Command seriously believed that 10 ships without air cover could break through to Okinawa and change the course of the war. The Americans had too many planes, too many ships, too much of everything. The men who drew up Operation Tengo were not fools. They could do the arithmetic as well as anyone. The honest answer is that this mission was never really about winning, and that is the hardest part to sit with. Some who planned it spoke, afterward, of honor, of the idea that the Navy could not simply sit in port while the army and the people suffered and died, that the great ships had to be seen to fight to the very end, whatever the cost. Others have suggested darker, colder motives, that a symbol had to be spent so that the nation could feel that everything possible had been done. The truth of what was in the minds of the men who gave the order will never be fully known. They took much of it to their graves. What we are left with is not a strategy. It is a sacrifice. Nearly 3,000 men on one ship, sent out to die for an idea, so that a nation could tell itself a story about how it had faced the end. The wreck of Yamato was not found for 40 years. In the 1980s, expeditions finally located her, lying more than 1,000 feet down on the floor of the East China Sea, southwest of the island of Kyushu. She is in 2 main pieces. The force of that magazine explosion had torn the mighty ship apart. Divers and cameras that have since visited the site describe steel armor plate, some of the thickest ever forged, ripped and folded like paper. Scattered across the seabed around her lie the ordinary things: boots, dishes, personal belongings. The small human evidence that this was not only a machine, but a home to thousands of men, most of whom are still there, in the dark, with her. The site is treated as a resting place now, with a care that came far too late for the men inside it. Expeditions that go there go quietly. They do not disturb what they find. because everyone who has looked down at that broken hull understands what they are really seeing, and it is not a warship anymore. It is one of the largest single graves of the largest war the world has ever known, and it has no headstones, only steel. Because that is what the wreck of Yamato truly is. It is not a monument to a great weapon. It is a grave. It is the resting place of nearly 3,000 men who have no other grave, whose families, in most cases, received nothing back. No body, no belongings. Only a notification and a silence, and the knowledge that their son, or husband, or brother was somewhere at the bottom of the sea, inside the ship whose name meant the soul of their country. In the years since, memorials have risen on land to try to hold that memory. In the city of Kure, where she was built behind those great screens of netting, there is now a museum with a vast, detailed model of the ship, and walls that carry the names and the faces of the men who died on her. Old survivors, while they still lived, would come and stand before it. Families still come. They come not to admire a battleship. They come to find a name. And this is where the story turns back on itself. Back to that false sun the pilots saw on the horizon. We remember Yamato. Of all the ships of that war, hers is one of the names that has survived, spoken in documentaries and books and games, a byword for scale and power and doom. The ship is famous. The ship is remembered. But fame is a strange and selective thing. We remember the steel. We remember the size of the guns and the height of the explosion. It is so much harder to remember the 17-year-old cadet who was kept aboard when his friend was sent ashore. The engine room crew sealed in the dark below the waterline. The junior officer who lived and spent the rest of his life trying to make the rest of us understand what it had cost. We remember the legend. We forget the boys. Imagine, just for a moment, being one of them. Imagine standing on that deck on the last night, passing the cup, knowing where the ship is bound, and looking at the faces around you, most of them younger than 25, and understanding that in 2 days, almost none of these faces will exist anywhere but in someone's memory. That is not a legend. That is not a symbol. That is a room full of young men, saying a quiet goodbye to each other and to the world. They did not choose the war. Most of them did not choose the mission. They were handed a death, dressed up as an honor, and they went, because that is what was asked of them, and because the young are so often the ones who pay for the decisions of the old. It is an old pattern, older than this war, older than any of the great ships. The men who decide are rarely the men who go, and the men who go are so often barely men at all, still half boys, sent out with a flag and a phrase about honor to do the dying that the arithmetic had already promised. Yamato did not break that pattern. She is one of its largest and clearest examples, written in 3,000 names across the floor of the sea. More than 3,000 of them are still out there, 1,000 feet down, wrapped in the torn steel of the ship that was supposed to keep them safe. The sea has kept them for 80 years, and it will keep them for as long as the sea keeps anything. No one will ever bring them home. The most we can do, the only thing we can do, is refuse to let them shrink into a number. So remember the ship if you like. But remember, more, the boys who went down inside her. Remember that behind the most famous sinking of the war were nearly 3,000 ordinary lives, each one whole, each one loved, each one ended in an afternoon, for a mission that could never have worked. A name spoken aloud is a life honored, and the men of Yamato, the boys of Yamato, deserve far more than to be remembered only as the crew of a legend. They deserve to be remembered as people. If you believe they should not vanish into the size of the story that swallowed them, then stay with us, and help us keep saying their story, so that they are not lost a second time to silence.